Hello everyone, and welcome to the Building Your First Widget Demo Theater session focused on Experience Builder. My name is David Martinez, and I am with the Experience Builder development team. And with that, let's get started. Today's agenda is pretty simple. We're going to create a widget. Let's get into it. Now for our particular widget, what we're going to do is we're going to use a radio component to filter the widget on the data source so that my list widget receives the same updates as my map widget. And if I had any other corresponding widgets, they would receive those updates as well. So I'm going to go into my Visual Studio Code, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and copy a boilerplate widget called Simple Widget, paste it into our widget directory, and we're basically going to just build this on the fly. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to name this folder to datasource.filter. And then what we're going to do now is make sure that the manifest name matches the folder's name of this. And we're going to add filter here. And then the next thing what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of this string here. This is a long string. And we're just basically going to say, okay, we want this string to be Dev Summit Demo Theater. And let's get rid of this. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to support some translation strings for Spanish as well. So now we can just hit save. Now since this widget is bare bones, we got to add some folders to here. So one we need is in the runtime folder. We need a new folder called translations to house our translation strings. So that's not caps. It's not R. Okay, yeah, okay, all right. So translations here, and we're going to add in a new file, and this is going to be default.ts, and we're going to add another one for the translations for Spanish. Okay, and since we're in here, let's go on the source level and add a new folder for setting, and we'll add a new file for our setting TSX because this one doesn't have it. Let's go to our translations folder for default TSS, and let's add in our default strings. So for our widget label, we're going to have data source filter, so that's going to overwrite the manifest, and then the rest of these labels are for our radio component strings. Let's do the same for our translation strings for Spanish, and actually wrong one. Hit save and close this. Now let's go back in our settings TSX and fix this. So this is bare bones. We need to add in import the classes and interfaces and components that we're going to use. Let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is React. Experience Builder is built on React. Every component is basically a widget. And in fact, I use those words interchangeably. So if you hear that throughout the presentation, basically, if I say component, I'm talking about a widget within Experience Builder. JSX is some syntax that we're going to use. Data source types. So all these come from GMU core. Data source types is basically the one supported in Experience Builder. Immutable is going to be used for the data structure for declaring the feature layer. And then use data source is an interface it's going to use to get information from the data source like the widget is using. Okay. We just have a couple more. To get the props of the widget, we can, in the framework, uses all widget setting props. So this is the props that are injected into the widget. Okay. And the last import that we're going to do is the most important one because it's the data source selector. This is a component that we're going to use to do this. Now that we have everything we need for our settings to implement our logic for our code, we're going to go ahead and export the default class setting. It's going to extend the React Pure component. We're going to load in the type for all widget settings. We're going to use the unknown keyword. So unknown's basically the type safe counterpart of any type. The next step in this is to declare the supported types of what we're going to use in this data source selector. And ours is going to be immutable. It's going to be data source types.featureLayer. If you're going to use WebMap or WebScene alone, you would just put data source types.webmap or WebScene. But this one, we're going to use feature layer for this particular demo. Now, the next step that I need to do is I need to create a function to handle the setting change of the data source selector. So if a user changes the data source selected, we need to handle that. We'll call this on data source change. It takes the parameters of use data source on setting change. For this prop setting change, we're going to pass in the ID of this prop's ID and then use the data source. The final steps for the widget, for the settings TSX, is to add the render method for this class component. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in our data source selector inside a div. So here's our data source selector component. Must use data source. Basically, if this equals false, you're going to have a toggle on there for your data source selector. So if you're used to using like widget or image widget, they have that data source toggle on there. That toggle on there, not data source. But by default, it's true. For types, we're going to use this supported types, which is the feature layer, right? Use data source is this .props use data source. On change, here's our data source change, and then widget ID is this prop.id. Okay, so now if we hit save, what we need to do is come into our project, and what we need to do is start the service over because we've added some new files. So anytime you add new files or folders, or you change the manifest, you need to restart the client service so Webpack can listen to those changes again. We'll hit refresh in our experience builder, and if we did everything right, this shouldn't give us any errors. So here we go. Here's our simple widget. I'm not worried about these strings because we're going to change that, but let's just format this a little differently. Okay. Here's our data source selector component. It's going to select a feature layer, and we're going to select the one that's used in the map. Now that the settings TSX is done, we can focus on the widget TSX. I'm going to close that down. And here's the boilerplate code we received when we copied that simple widget TSX. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to import some classes and interfaces that we're going to use, and we'll just talk through these as I add them. Okay, so the first one is the data source component. This is the component to use the data source. SQL query params interface is basically used for the query parameters. Data source manager will be used to manage the data source. The queryable data source extends the data, and it's going to add query capabilities based right for that. And then our last one, which is part of GIMU core for this one, is the data source. So this is the interface for all data source types. Now, since we added those strings for the translations, we like to use those. So we're going to do is import default messages for the translations default. That's the folder, and this is default location. Now, what I want to do with this particular one, I want to be able to have some components that I could use in the renderer. I'm particularly interested in a radio button and a label. If I go over to the developer documentation site and I go into guide, Storybook, this is a development environment and playground for UI components. We have a hosted version, and we've exported some of our components that we use as part of Experience Builder under components. And I'm looking for a radio button with a label, and this is exactly what I want. So if I click on the docs, here's all the props, here's the callback, etc. I can look at the code. Everything looks good here. And what I can just simply do is just copy this and use this inside my project. I'll import that. One thing I need to add here is we also want to add the label component. And the last thing that I want to do as part of this one is I want to add in the default messages for the UI messages, because we're going to use a default message with a label for the radio button that doesn't have a string, and I'll show you where that goes. Now that we have all our imports done, we can start working on the logistics. But before we get into our class widget, let's declare an interface for the state of how we're going to manage our policy type. So this policy type is going to use a enum for this, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to use a enum policy type, which is just using enum string, a literal. So this will be policy type.auto h03 h04, and now what we can do is we can start implementing our widget. So we're not going to use this im config, and what we'll do is we'll just stick with the unknown here type. And what we'll do is now is we'll add in our state here of our interface, and now this is giving me an error, which is great because it's missing. We just need to add that within this constructor here so that it initializes this state, which is policy type for none. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and add in a placeholder for a React lifecycle method called will unmount, and I'll explain that later, but for now I'm just going to add it as a placeholder. And we can get rid of this because we're not going to use this since it's causing an error. Okay, let's build our functions to handle the logistics of what we need to accomplish here. The first one that I'm going to need to implement is this one called getQuery. And this getQuery is going to look at the policy type as a parameter. It's going to use the enum policy type. So we're going to look at the state. We'll pass that to SQL query parameters, and we'll return this getFilter policy type function. So we need to create a getFilter function that it's expecting here. And within this getFilter function, we're going to do the same type of params, policy type, string, so it's expecting a return, not a void. Then we're going to do some simple logic here. If policy type and policy type does not equal policy none, then return the policy type. Otherwise, give me everything back, because we're going to have 4 buttons in there. One's none, which is give everything back, every category. And then we're going to have individual filtering. Now that that's done, and on a radio button component, we're going to have a callback. So we need to be able to add a callback for that. So we're going to call that on radio button change. And the first thing that we need to do in this function is to get the value selected for the target. When a user clicks the radio button, it's going to have a target. That target's going to be a value. It'll be none, auto, h04. Once we have that, we're going to set the state to that policy type. And once we set that state, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get the props of the data source with the data source ID and use data source manager to get the instance by the ID as a queryable data source. And using that data source, once I have it, I'll add some simple logic to say, hey, if this data source, then do data source update query params method to update the data source query. Pass it to this .getQuery function with the policy type and the props ID. Now, part of the data source component, when we add that to our renderer method, there's a callback in there. And within that callback, we have to create a function to ensure that there is an update in the data source component as in the event that other widgets want to use that same data source. So what we're going to do for that callback is have this function called onDataSourceCreated. So it's going to do if this .state policy type and data source. We have a queryable data source, and then we're going to update the query in the data source .query policies, this state.policy type, and this props ID. All right. Now let's go back up into our widget unmount, and let me add my code in here, and I'll talk about this. So after the widget loads, we're going to use the component will unmount from React to reset the query. This logic is basically the same as the on radio button change, with the exception of we're going to update this to query to take in policy type.none. Now, once we have that, our logic looks pretty complete there. What we need to do now is we're going to add in the data source component to the renderer method here. And we're going to say, okay, data source component. What we need here is we have a data source component. So data source component, use data source. This props use data source, the widget IDs, this props.id, and then on data source is created. Here's our callback. Call this function. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we need to add in the label and radio component. But before we do that, I want to add in the translations of the message, which is basically select the policy type. So we're going to add a div, and we're going to grab this props international format message by ID, and default message is select policy. So it's going to select right here. Select that, and it's going to add this string right there. Okay. Our next step is to add in the label component, and the label component is going to have a CSS style here, and that style is going to be a cursor pointer as a user hovers over that. We'll do the same style for the radio button, so it's a consistent pattern here. Style cursor pointer. The value though is going to be policy type.none. Now we're going to do this for each other button, auto, HO3, HO4. And the next thing we're going to do is to see if the button is clicked, we're going to use the check prop in here to set for the state of the policy here. So checked, this.state policy equals policy type.none. And then our last step is to handle the callback. And that callback is going to be basically bind to on radio button change. Now, we're almost done with this. The last part of this is to add the other component labels. And but before I do that, I need to add in the string for the format message. So in this particular one, since it's none and we don't have any defaults, we're going to say ID none, and default message just use Gem UIs right here, none. Okay, so let's just copy in the rest of the steps because it's pretty repetitive. Once we did it for the top one, I believe you should have the idea of how to finish this out. So these are for the other ones, same workflow, except instead of Gem UI messages, we're going to call on the type auto, because that's its ID, and then we're going to call default messages auto, so it cries auto, HO3, etc. So now if I hit save, I go back into my widget here, and let's hit refresh. Here's our policy type here. Let's go into preview mode, and by default it's on none. Nothing's being filtered, but if I click auto, you can see my list widgets receiving the update. So any other widget that's utilizing this data source is going to be updated. Okay. If I want to debug this widget, I just go in my developer tools here, go to sources, and have it on widget. So you're going to want to look for the widget.tsx with the number at the end. You're going to see a bunch of other widgets, like I would see widget.jss for the distributor code for the list. But if we run this widget, we can debug this. We can get a lot of good information out of here. And in fact, if you're new to Experience Builder development, this is a good way to really understand it. Okay, so I'm going to go back, and it's going to go back to on data source created once this loads. Okay, great. So we have on data source here. Here's our ID for our data source. Okay, now we're going to go up to get filter policy types, which policy type is none. Okay, none. Right, so we're going to bypass this, and we're going to go straight to this one because we're going to get everything back. We want 1 equals 1. Okay, now let's make a change. So on radio bus change, we have a mouse event. It's a change. Our target values auto. Let's see, our state would be policy auto, and you can see here's the data source ID. Here's a queryable data source. Here's the records. You can get that. If data source, which I got. So here you can look at all kinds of different stuff in the data source. The ID, here's the manager, actual count, the ID, etc. Here's the last count query parameters. just by debugging this. Here's the policy type auto. Okay. Once we get that policy type auto, and there we go. Now let's get back into our presentation. Here are some helpful resources. The code for this presentation is in that shortened GitHub URL that's contained a repo of this source code from today's presentation. If you're interested in other samples, you can check out our public repo for our SDK resources. We're constantly going to be adding more in the next couple months, so take a look at those. And if you want to see a particular sample that maybe we haven't covered, I would suggest maybe post an issue in there, tag me, and we'll take a look at it. And then if you haven't used Experience Builder, check out our doc site. We're constantly making improvements on it. For over this next year, you're gonna see more snippets, more API ref documenting it, more code samples focused around that. So you'll see some significant improvements. And if you should have any questions or feedback, if you're not already on there, join the GeoNet community forum for ArcGIS Experience Builder. I'm always on there trying to make some time throughout the week to answer questions. And with that, please provide your feedback for the session because I got to get some new shoes, so make sure I get 5s. No, I'm kidding. All seriousness. If there's a particular session you want to see or a particular topic, of something you want us to cover in a session, you can give some feedback then. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for attending this, and you guys enjoy your day. Take care, everyone.